The Industrial Revolution began in Europe in 1760 and marked the transition to the modern global economy we have today. Mass production utilizing machinery and technology, along with land and labor, has enabled the provision of goods and services on a scale that was once impossible. Europe, with its dense population and internal competition among different countries, was at the forefront of technological and economic advancements. Before that, Europeans were pioneers in truly global trade, and the Dutch even created the corporation as a way to finance risky ventures. Global trade, industrialization, and modern corporations have made our world thousands of times richer than it was 2 centuries ago. The world has generated more economic value in the last 40 years than in any other period since humans emerged from their caves combined. However, the birthplace of these initial developments that made all this possible, Europe, has started to lag behind. Europe has experienced stagnant economic growth for over a decade, while the rest of the world has generally fared well. Ignoring the growth of countries like China, which has been an outlier during this period, Europe as a whole has performed much worse than its most obvious comparison, the United States. Both are large economic regions with abundant natural resources, highly skilled populations, well-functioning democratic governments, and modern infrastructure, making them competitive globally across various industries. Still, Europe has fallen behind, facing challenges and setbacks not just in the last decade, but for some time. Issues like Brexit, the Eurozone crisis, youth unemployment, and ongoing social problems related to an aging population and retirement have contributed to Europe's economic woes. It's essential to delve deeper and ask why this is happening, continuing to question until we reach the fundamental problems hindering Europe. Understanding the underlying reasons for Europe's numerous challenges and economic growth setbacks will be crucial to ensure it doesn't happen elsewhere, and potentially to get Europe back on track. So, what caused Europe to start falling behind the United States? Should economists expect this kind of slowdown everywhere? And finally, why could all of this be a blessing in disguise for Europe's economic future? Before getting into the fundamental problems hindering Europe, I want to quickly provide a big disclaimer. This video will analyze some future projections, but nobody can predict the future, least of all economists. With that out of the way, there is a general expectation among many economists that countries naturally follow a predictable pattern of growth. Underdeveloped economies start by depending on basic agriculture and informal markets. They then become developing economies as they create industrial machinery from scratch, as during the Industrial Revolution, or receive it through foreign investment, as has been the case in most developing economies recently. Building it from scratch is obviously the slower process, which is why it took Europe almost 200 years to move from being agricultural to industrial. However, a country like South Korea was able to do the same in 2 decades. Being an industrialized economy means that production is growing rapidly as more tools are used to harness existing resources. After an economy is fully industrialized, it faces the challenging part of transitioning from being an economy that simply manufactures things to one that adds value in other ways, such as providing services and directly engaging in foreign markets. The developing economy also benefits from the modern corporation with shareholders, first conceived by the Dutch. It is the most effective way to do this. Advanced economies have gotten there by improving their ability to not just be able to make things, but to make everyone else make things. This might seem like advanced countries are taking advantage of poorer countries to do all their work for them. And sometimes that does happen. But most of the time, it can be a mutually beneficial arrangement. It's better for a developing country to have the opportunity to manufacture something like a car instead of a hammer. Both products need to be made, but the car is much more technical, so the developing country would depend on an advanced economy to provide them with the designs and tools needed to manufacture it. Meanwhile, a simple hammer, they could probably figure out themselves. The advanced economy benefits from this arrangement because it can use a low-cost workforce to manufacture its cars, allowing it to offer them to the global market at a more competitive price and generate more profits domestically. The developing economy also benefits because building a car from scratch adds much more value to raw materials than building a hammer does. If labor costs are a smaller portion of the total cost of a good or service, there is more room for wage movement while still remaining competitive. Advanced, high-income countries still manufacture many things themselves, but the goods they produce always add significant value. Whether it takes a team of engineers 1,000 hours to assemble a jet engine in the United States or the United Kingdom, The final price of that good is tens of millions of dollars. Even though labor costs are high per hour, they are still only a small fraction of the final cost. Developing economies typically don't have the facilities or expertise to construct these globally competitive products. Since advanced economies can produce them domestically without a major loss in price competitiveness, there is no incentive for them to provide the investment and training that developing economies would need to do it themselves. Even if the products were slightly cheaper, it's not worth the risk of having companies in advanced economies share their world-leading designs with factories worldwide, because there's a significant chance they would be stolen, and it's very difficult to recover design secrets once they are available. Moreover, even though it might be a bit cheaper, it could end up being a less competitive good overall, because there will be less demand, whether people admit it or not. People would prefer to fly across the Pacific with jet engines made in the United States rather than, say, China. This means that developing economies typically grow by starting with very basic items and then move on to building slightly more advanced items over time. But they eventually run into a problem. They shift from manufacturing very basic items for little money to semi-advanced products for a decent amount of money. Then their people get used to this higher income and get outcompeted by other developing economies coming behind them. The reason all this is important is that Europe is mainly composed of economies that are already advanced, but most of them developed a long time ago, especially in Western Europe. Europe has its own international companies operating in advanced industries, but not as many. Collectively, it has about 2,000 global companies like Japan, but with a much larger population. It's also far behind the United States, which has roughly twice as many major global companies as the entire Europe combined. Many of these companies also exist just to serve their home countries. Orange is one of the largest telecommunications companies in the world and is the 31st largest in all of Europe. But if you don't live in Europe, you probably never heard of it. Companies can still do well by catering only to the European market because it consists of advanced and wealthy economies, but they only advanced because they built these modern industries before anyone else, and today lack innovative global companies to compete with the United States and even new players from Asia. In a way, they are living off the legacy of their advanced country, while the United States is at the peak of its career. Of course, before the comments start including European companies with global operations, there are exceptions to this. Germany, in particular, hosts many world-leading companies in a variety of high-tech industries, and even France is the global epicenter of fashion, which is a very lucrative and surprisingly large industry. There are exceptions, but overall, the continent is underrepresented in global corporations, and whether we like it or not, these corporations are the conduits through which major advanced economies become advanced economies. The correlation between the 2,000 global companies per capita and per capita GDP is very strong. But Europe lags behind. Now people might point out that there are many very small economies worldwide that are advanced but are not home to major global corporations. Many in Europe, for that matter, places like Luxembourg, which has the highest per capita GDP of any micronation in the world. And even though they cheat a bit to get that figure, they have a very prosperous economy in their own right. But these smaller countries get there by providing services to the larger countries that do have the global wealth generators. Singapore, Ireland, Hong Kong, Luxembourg, and even Switzerland to a lesser extent have become advanced economies by providing financial services to other larger advanced countries. Well said, to become an advanced economy, a country needs to have advanced industries that don't heavily rely on workers' wages, or industries that can operate exclusively worldwide to bring profits home. Europe had an early advantage because it was the first continent to properly industrialize, but now it's falling behind the United States and Asia, especially in technology, which is one of the easiest industries to operate worldwide. The problems at a superficial level appearing in the headlines have been accelerated by this concentration of global operations. But we can delve deeper again and ask the next obvious question: why doesn't Europe have more global companies? It's difficult to directly compare the underlying characteristics of the United States with Europe because the United States is a country and, although it's a very large and diverse country, it's still not as diverse as Europe, which is made up of dozens of countries speaking different languages and having different governments and even very different economic levels. Productively, Ukraine and Kosovo have a tenth of the per capita GDP of Luxembourg and Ireland, so the differences within Europe are possibly greater than the differences between Europe as a whole and the United States in general. Although European countries are seen as more egalitarian and put a greater emphasis on comfortable working conditions and social protections to ensure everyone lives comfortably at the expense of higher taxes for higher income people. That relaxed attitude, in contrast with the fierce economic growth attitude of the United States, theoretically largely explains this division. And many countries in Europe, especially those most famous for their strong social policies, actually have higher rates of engagement with new businesses. Europeans also work fewer hours, preferring a comfortable work-life balance compared to their American counterparts, and the data supports this. In Germany and France, the two largest economies in continental Europe, employed people work just over 10,000 hours a year, respectively. If the supposedly lazy French work more than the industrious Germans, I'm sure my German researchers will love that statistic. But both lag far behind the United States, where the average employed person works almost 10,000 hours. These working hours have decreased significantly in the United States, around 25% since their peak in the 1950s and 10% since 2000. But they have decreased much more in major European centers. France and Germany used to work much more than the United States, but now they work less. In Germany, these hours have decreased by almost 50%. So yes, growth in Europe has been slower, but much of that has been the major economies exchanging higher production for lower working conditions. And yes, that causes problems, especially when many of our economic systems are based on stable growth. But I'm sure many people would be happy to trade those problems for an additional 200 hours per year. The economy is a study of how people interact with things of value, and there is not much more valuable than time. So it's hard to call this an economic failure on Europe's part. It's more of a choice, and like all economic choices, it has trade-offs. Only these trade-offs make better headlines. Now, this is not the only factor. Workers in the United States work much less than many other workers in less prosperous countries worldwide. And the other important factor is worker productivity. How much value a worker produces in a given hour of work. To make workers more productive, they can be provided with better education so they can work in more skilled roles or be provided with better tools to work more efficiently. Between the United States and Europe, education is roughly on par, with Europe doing slightly better. But the United States is more attractive for qualified migration, so overall, they are very similar. However, the United States simply has much better capital. Average companies invest much more in their workers than the same companies in Europe. The reason they do this is that they can. The United States is a very attractive destination for investors. It uses the world's reserve currency, has a solid legal system, a strong culture of innovation, speaks English, and is a one-stop shop for investors. In the United States, it's really not worth investing anywhere else. Compare that to investing even in major European markets, where investors would have to navigate multiple legal systems and tax codes in various languages, all to access markets that historically have had lower returns than the United States. Having access to investment to generate capital is how multinational companies are built. Even if Europe has more new companies with better ideas than the United States, if American companies are the only ones getting the capital to rapidly expand worldwide, then they will win. And that trend makes them even more attractive to investors in a kind of self-fulfilling economic prophecy. The only question that remains is whether this trend will last. Obviously, nobody can predict the future, least of all economists, but the leadership that the United States has been able to build through the advantage it has with its huge global companies, especially tech ones, probably won't be as strong in the future. The big tech giants had free reign over the entire planet for a long time, and now laws are catching up with this new technology. This comes at the same time as a shift away from globalization and towards national industries managed within economies or with their close neighbors. Europe may not have benefited as much from the modern globalized economy, but it won't suffer as much from its contraction, either because it already has the European Union, which was built around the idea of close trade between neighbors. Even if Europe never catches up, gross output is really only one aspect of economic success, and Europe is so far ahead of the United States in many economic metrics as the United States is in all others. A large part of the success of European economies will depend on whether the European Union also meets its goals. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment. Also, please consider liking and subscribing. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.